You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Jake Wallis-Simons, and the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Sodha. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Eye leads with demands from the UK for answers from Israel over the 7 aid workers, 3 of them British, killed by an Israeli airstrike in Gaza. 3 Britons killed on Gaza mercy mission. That's the front of the Daily Express. The Telegraph too says that Rishi Sunak has told Israel that he's appalled by the deaths and described the situation in Gaza as intolerable. The Guardian says charities have suspended aid operations in Gaza as a result of the killings. The Financial Times says there are doubts over the speed of the shift towards electric vehicles as sales for Tesla and their Chinese rivals, BYD, have slowed. The Metro has a story concerning an embarrassing misunderstanding over an auction. And the Star heralds the arrival of telltale fridges that can reveal who scoffed their last piece of pie. I think I could invest in one of those. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Jake Wallis-Simons and Sonia Sodha. Welcome to both of you. I mean, we start with this horrific story, front page of the Daily Express and others, the 3 Britons killed on what they describe as their mercy mission in Gaza, the aid workers, 2 of which have been named this evening. Sonia.
Yeah, it's just a terribly tragic story. So this was a convoy of 3 vehicles. They were carrying food in Gaza and they were hit by Israel. And I think there are huge questions facing Israel tonight. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has come out and, offered condolences, but no explanation as of yet. And I think the questions are, these were, it was a clearly marked convoy. It was marked with the name of the charity, of the aid organisation at the top. The people travelling in the convoy were wearing, badges to say that they were humanitarian aid workers. So the question is, how could this have happened? How could aid workers have been hit? And this is going to have all sorts of consequences because, first of all, there's the absolute tragic loss of life. 3 British citizens, an Australian citizen, a Polish citizen, number among them. And that's why we've seen world leaders come out and say, Israel needs to be held accountable for this, essentially. But also this will have ramifications for, Gaza's already in an absolutely terrible state in terms of the humanitarian conditions. You've got lots of officials warning about the fact that, Gaza is effectively on the point of famine. There isn't enough aid going in. And this is leading to, there aren't that many aid organisations still operative in Gaza, as we heard your correspondent talking about in the 10 o'clock bulletin. And this has led to aid organisations saying that they've got no choice but to withdraw for the moment in order to keep their workers safe. So there's going to be knock-on consequences for, taking an already terrible situation in Gaza, making it worse.
And Jake, the question has to be, how could this have happened? We know that aid agencies have their movements coordinated by the Israeli army, so they know where they are at all times. We are told that it's a mistake. The evidence, some suggesting, pointing otherwise.
Well, look, I mean, these were 3 very brave people doing some vital work. There were 3, the British victims were 3 former soldiers, 1 former Royal Marine, a former Special Forces hero and an Army veteran. And it does seem as if this wasn't a stray shot because they were targeted more than once and there were more than 1 car in the convoy. So there were pinpoint strikes that took them out. So it does point to more of a failure of intelligence. I mean, it's inconceivable that the Israeli army would have intentionally targeted an aid convoy when it could have been targeting Hamas. I mean, there's no way, to my mind, that would have happened. But the Israeli intelligence has got this formidable reputation with good reason. It's been impressive over the past 7.5 decades, carrying out audacious feats that people would have thought is impossible. But it has failed a lot, in particular on October the 7th as well, which was a huge failure of Israeli intelligence not seeing this thing coming. And this does seem, I mean, on the face of it, no one knows, and the investigation hasn't really begun yet properly, but it does seem as if it would be a failure of intelligence rather than anything else.
And Sonia, as you were alluding to, charities now suspending their work after losing so many in this type of, targeted attack, it seems.
Well, as you said, Gillian, because it's hard to understand how, what kind of intelligence failure could have led to this, really, because as you said, there are established protocols in war zones in order to keep humanitarian workers safe, because if you start to encroach on the code that humanitarian workers can't go in and deliver aid in an area without organisations, fearing actually not just that their workers may be caught up in bombing raids, for example, but actually may be targeted. If you can't keep that principle sacrosanct, then that really undermines the notion of neutral humanitarian aid going in to help very, very desperate people, innocent people who are living in, what is a total war zone. The question is, those protocols will have been followed, these vehicles were marked. I think there has been some suggestion from Israel today, hasn't there, that they thought that this convoy may have been, there may have been someone from Hamas kind of travelling with it, but that clearly wasn't the case. And so I think there are questions, even if there was a terrorist who had been travelling with this, why were they still knowingly targeting an aid convoy?
Well, I think it's important not to get too ahead of ourselves, because, we assume that the protocols are being followed. They weren't necessarily being followed. They might have mistakenly departed from them, gone too late, gone too early. There could have been an intelligence mix-up in terms of another convoy that was nearby that was a terrorist convoy that they got mixed up. There's so many possibilities that will all hopefully come out in the investigation. I think we need to wait for that, but it's really important this investigation happens thoroughly and quickly and does get to the bottom of what actually went on here, and ideally leads to a change in protocols to make sure that this never happens again, because it's tragic whichever way you look at it. There's no good outcome for anybody here. It's absolutely horrendous. But the one thing I would add as well, though, is that it's really easy to focus in on the British victims because they're familiar to us, because they're from our own country. But let's not forget the other victims as well.
No, we have said that there were seven
as well.
We've heard from Australia,
of course, but I also mean the innocent Palestinian victims and Israeli victims as well.
Yeah. Just wondered what you both made of the tone from Netanyahu, because he has said that, this shouldn't happen again, but also quoted as saying it happens in war.
Well, I think that was a really ill-advised thing to say, actually, because it sounds like an excuse, doesn't it? Or it sounds like something that, you can't avoid some of these mistakes. It feels like that there's that sort of implication there, and it's completely and utterly unacceptable. He should not have said that, because this shouldn't happen in war. There are things to prevent humanitarian aid workers being targeted, suffering this kind of awful death. There are things in place to prevent that. So it shouldn't happen in war.
I agree.
Do you think he got the tone wrong?
Well, I think that it was clumsily phrased, but I think I know what he was trying to say. Last year, 62 aid workers were killed in warfare around the world, and so it does happen, but saying this sort of thing just happens does sound a bit flippant and throwaway. You're right, it shouldn't happen, particularly when you're talking about an advanced army with precision munitions and highly developed intelligence. It shouldn't happen, and I think that he could have phrased it more sensitively and showed a bit more. He was contrite. He could have showed more contrition in terms of the messaging. But I think that the point he was making is one that one can relate to, which is that there seems to be a sense when people observe warfare these days, who haven't experienced it themselves, that you can somehow avoid all civilian casualties altogether, that you can avoid any kind of errors, any mistakes, any mistaken actions by soldiers. And you just can't, because war is always hellish. And the average ratio of combatants to civilians around the world, according to the UN, is 1 to 9. So Israel's doing much better than the average, but civilian casualties cannot be avoided. This, however, should be.
Sonia, to the eye and the international voices, that headline there saying the UK demands answers after the strike. And we know that Rishi Sunak has spoken with Benjamin Netanyahu this evening. He's described the events as intolerable?
Well, I think in the wake of this, you're going to see... You've already seen a toughening up in tone, actually, from Israel's key allies, including here in the UK, including from the US. And I think what you're seeing is a further hardening in tone, as you would expect after, international aid workers have been killed. And I think it is important to say, this isn't... It's not like they were caught up in some bombing raid. They were, this convoy was targeted, which I think is...
Sure,
I don't think anyone... I think lots of people would acknowledge that, civilians lose their lives in war, and that is incredibly tragic. But this was a targeting of this convoy.
Sure, but they weren't targeted because they were humanitarian aid workers. They were not. I mean, I think it's impossible. I mean, the only thing I could conceive of is if some rogue person targeted them out of some kind of weird grip of some criminality. But I think that's very, very unlikely indeed. It's certainly not the case that Israel, as a state, would have said, right, let's go and target humanitarian aid workers. It was an error, it was a mistake, it was a tragic error. The Prime Minister of Israel has acknowledged that and apologised for it and expressed great regret and launched an investigation. We have to wait and see what the results of that is. But it seems to me that the indications point to some kind of grave intelligence.
And do you think it's a possibility that they were not identified as humanitarian aid workers,
look, I don't know.
even though the vehicles were clearly marked?
I don't know. I don't want to speculate. But I'm pretty confident in saying that I'm almost certain to say that this wouldn't be anything intentional at all. The Prime Minister said that already. It's some kind of awful, grave error.
And what's your assessment of the relationship, the international relationships now?
Yeah, so, I mean, just to come back to that, so I do think... So clearly there's going to be massive implications in terms of delivery of aid into Gaza, but I think actually for Israel as well, this is... There has been an ebbing away of support for Israel and Israel's military action, I think, as people have seen the profound humanitarian consequences in Gaza. And I think world leaders knew when they supported Israel's right to defend itself, as Jake said, there's no such thing as a clean war. There was always tragic innocent civilian loss of life in war. But I think the scale of what we've seen in Gaza has been very difficult to comprehend. And I think, whether this was an error, whether something else went wrong, whatever it was, this is going to, I think, lead to a further undermining of support for Israel. And I think it's going to have ramifications for Israel's standing in the international community, as well as kind of for the people of Gaza.
We know from reports, speaking to our political correspondent, John Craig, that the conversation between Rishi Sunak and Benjamin Netanyahu was terse, to say the very, very least. Do you think that this incident in particular will be a turning point in terms of how the international community deals with Netanyahu and Israel?
I don't think so. I mean, obviously, this is, as we've agreed, is an awful moment in the war. But I think that overall, the picture, and it will ratchet up pressure on Israel from different quarters, but I think overall the position remains the same. I mean, the US, President Biden is making quite aggressive noises towards Israel, rhetorically, and at the UN Security Council last week as well. But that isn't matched in terms of his policy. Last week, billions of pounds worth of bombs and fighter jets were sent to Israel by the US, including 500-pound bombs and 1,800 2,000-pound bombs and some F-15s as well, F-35, sorry.
But do you think the fact that one of the victims is a US-Canadian national?
Look, it's a diplomatic, a lot of diplomatic tension will follow. We saw the Israeli ambassador being summoned in Britain, and I imagine a similar thing will happen in the United States as well. But I think that hopefully the investigation will prove what went wrong, and there'll be some changes made to make sure this never happens again. And that hopefully should calm the troubled waters.
Okay. But I think that there is also a concern, though, a growing concern in the international community that that Israel's military objective, as stated, isn't achievable, and that actually in Netanyahu, you've got a prime minister who, he's got his own political interests that he's thinking about, and it's in his political interests in some ways to extend this conflict because there is accountability that he will face in Israel for that massively gross intelligence failure around October the 7th. So I think there is a concern that actually how well thought through is Israel's action now.
I'm not sure I would say that. I mean, I've heard that theory, and I've heard it a lot, but I think that it's important to recognise that in Israel there's no commander-in-chief like there is in America, where Joe Biden calls the shots in terms of military action overseas. In Israel there's a war cabinet, and so Netanyahu doesn't have the power himself to extend the war, even if he was that evil to want to extend the war for his own political gain. It would be difficult to get that past the chief of staff and the various other war cabinet members and to actually implement that as a policy. I see what you're saying, but I think it's a bit far-fetched.
OK. Jake and Sonia, for the moment, thank you.